It's a real pleasure for me to be here tonight. I'm getting used to these little jaunts that I've been taking lately, and I expect there'll be quite a few more before November 3rd. In fact, there's going to have to be quite a few more, not only made by myself, but by your President Leroy and the other organizations that are serving with us on this coalition. We've got a big job ahead of us, and that's one of the things I want to talk about here tonight. But before I get started, Leroy told a couple political stories, so I've got a couple little favorites that I like to tell too, and I particularly thought of one tonight because I stopped at a truck stop to eat supper tonight, and all of these truckers reminded me of this story I heard one time about this truck driver pulled into this truck stop, and he went in there to get something to eat, and he ordered a cup of coffee and a hamburger and some shoestrings. And he was sitting there, and the waitress brought his meal and set it down in front of him. About that time, he heard this terrific roar, and 3 motorcycles pulled up in front of the truck stop, and 3 individuals clad in the Hells Angels type attire, dirty and bearded and everything, strode into this cafe using profanity. They just proceeded like they were going to take the place over. One of them walked over to the truck driver, picked up his hamburger, and proceeded to eat it. Another one walked over, took a handful of his shoestrings, started to eat them. The third one walked over and picked up his cup of coffee and started to drink it. And the truck driver just sat there. And finally, he asked the waitress for his tab, and he got the bill, went over to the cash register, paid the bill, never said a word, walked out of the place and got in his truck. And the waitress was still over by the cash register looking out the window. And one of the Hells Angels boys, he stood there and he said, wasn't much of a man, was he? And the waitress, watching the truck driver drive away, said, no, and he wasn't much of a truck driver either. He just ran over 3 motorcycles. Well, there was also the young preacher who was going to give his first sermon. And he was extremely nervous, and he wanted to make a big hit with the congregation. And he really wanted to come across big and let them know that he was a fiery and a full of enthusiasm type of a minister. And so he had written this speech out, and he almost memorized it. And he had it written out there, and so he worked all night long memorizing this speech, and he had it down pat. Man, he never missed a sentence. And he had this speech just perfect, and he thought, boy, this is really going to get him. And he'd written that speech so that it started off real dramatically, so he'd catch their attention right away. It started off with the words, "I am coming, said the Lord," because he wanted them to really sit up and take notice. So that Sunday, he was going to give his sermon, and he got before them, and the church was full. They all wanted to see what the new minister looked like. Even those people who were a little negligent in attending on Sundays were there. So he immediately started his sermon, and he said, "I am coming, said the Lord," and his mind went blank, just completely blank. He couldn't remember a thing else about that sermon. So he thought, well, I'll try it again, And he said, "I am coming, said the Lord," and he said it with even a little more vigor. And so he grabbed a hold of the podium, or the railing there, and he leaned forward into the railing once more, and he said, "I am coming, said the Lord." And it still didn't come to him, so he thought, well, one more time, it's got to come to me, So with all the vigor he could muster, he leaned forward and he said, "I am coming, said the Lord," and the railing broke, and he fell forward into the laps of 2 ladies in the front row. Oh, and he was just terribly embarrassed. What a way to start off, And he started making apologies right away, and one of the ladies says, "That's quite all right, Reverend, that's quite all right, don't apologize. You warned us 3 times you were coming, we should have had sense enough to get out of the way." Well, before I get into the subject of our tax bill and the need for tax reform in South Dakota, I want to just make a couple of real brief comments about the 1970 session of the South Dakota legislature. I've been going out there every year doing some part-time lobbying for Farmers Union, and each year it continues to get more frustrating, it seems like, because each year the need seems to be more critical and the results almost non-existent. I've come to the conclusion this year that I think our legislators were on the pill. You know, there's a lot of talk about the birth control pill. Well, I think our legislators must have been on the pill because they couldn't conceive anything. They were completely infertile. So that's the type of session it was. Certainly, we emphasized the need for tax reform when you go out and you get 45,000 signatures on petitions from people who feel that property taxes are at exorbitant highs and our system needs to be changed. That should tell them something. But apparently it didn't. But that wasn't the only problem. We had a corporation farm bill that we were very hopeful of getting passed this session. We thought everything looked good for it. The governor, in his State of the State message, endorsed legislation of this nature. He said it was needed. We needed legislation to regulate corporation farming in South Dakota. So what happened? We got the bill through the House, 46 to 28. And in the House, it had been assigned to the House Agriculture Committee. The year before, it had been assigned to the House Agriculture Committee. The year before that, it had been assigned to the Senate Agriculture Committee. It was always assigned to the Agriculture Committee, and that's where it should be assigned. After all, it's a corporate farm bill. It's a bill that deals with agriculture. So what happened to that bill after it passed the House? We'd done our lobbying beforehand. We had the votes to get that bill out of the Senate Ag Committee. But Lieutenant Governor Jim Abner didn't send that bill to the Senate Agriculture Committee. Instead, he sent it to the Senate State Affairs Committee, which is known as the Governor's Committee, and it's also referred to many times as the Graveyard Committee, and that's exactly what happened to the bill. It was buried there. Well, I'm bringing this up tonight before I get into this thing because you're going to be facing some primary battles on the legislative front in the various counties in this state. In your county, I imagine you may have a few yourself. And April 18th is the deadline for filing petitions. I think it's the 18th of April, is the deadline for filing petitions for office. And it still isn't too late. You don't need that many signers on a petition to go out and decide yourself to run for office, or to go out and find an able candidate to run for office. If your legislators didn't vote the way you wanted them to vote during the last session, if they failed to represent you the way you thought you should be represented, then maybe you should look around for somebody else to represent you. And if you don't do anything about this, then maybe you haven't got a gripe coming if they don't represent you right the next time around. So take a little political action on your own. Run for office, or find a good candidate to run, or if your candidate, your legislator did represent you the way you wanted, give him your wholehearted endorsement and support. Do a little campaigning for him, because he deserves it. But find out how they voted, and if they voted right, support them. If they didn't, get out and work for somebody else to oppose it. The only other thing I want to say about the legislature was that our initiated tax measure passed the Senate 33-0. And this is well and good. That's the way it should have been passed, because they are almost demanded by law to vote yes on an initiated measure. And yet, when that bill hit the House floor, there was a lot of legal maneuvering, parliamentary maneuvering. One of the legislators, Representative Charles Larkin, tried to get the bill sent back to the Judiciary Committee. He finally, he was defeated in that effort. And then, when they took the final vote, 17 legislators voted no, despite the fact they're mandated by law to vote yes. But now the measure is on the ballot. Thanks to you and people like you, it's on the ballot. Because we surprised a lot of legislators and a lot of people in this state because they said it couldn't be done in that short a time. We went out and we got 45,000 signatures on petitions in weather that got up to 35 below zero in less than 2 weeks' time. And I commend you for it, because Brown County led the way, and you're to be saluted for it. You got 2,302 signatures in your county. Our state total was 44,682. I'm confident if we'd had another month to work on it, you'd have tripled Brown County, and we'd have probably hit 75 or 80,000, maybe even 100,000 signatures, because Lord knows there's that many disenchanted taxpayers in South Dakota today. And disenchanted they should be, because our system is filled with inequities. It is antiquated, it is unfair, and it is becoming increasingly unfair to property owners in this state. Every year we go out to the legislature with this problem. We've been going out there for a number of years now with the same problem. And we always end up with the same results. If they need additional revenue, they raise it by increasing the inequitable sales tax. Now, the sales tax is a highly regressive tax, primarily because it's a flat rate item. Anytime you've got a flat rate tax, you've got a regressive tax, because you're putting a greater burden on those with the lowest incomes. A person making less than $2,000 a year, or less than $3,000 a year, pays 3.5% of their income in sales tax every year. And that's when the sales tax was only 3%. I haven't seen the figures for 4%, but it would be correspondingly higher. And the regressiveness is illustrated when you take a person that makes $15,000 a year. He pays only 1 1/10% of his income in sales taxes. Now that's figures from the report by Dr. James Papke for the state of South Dakota, the Papke Tax Study Report, a report that should have been the tax Bible for our legislature. And throughout that report, Dr. Papke doesn't actually come out and say it, but it is implied throughout the report that what South Dakota is lacking is a state income tax to balance its tax structure. And to me, this is one of the asinine things about the report that was authorized for Dr. Papke to do. When I was in school, in college, whether it was in high school or college, if we were supposed to do a study, and even in organizations when we had a committee to do a study, if the committee did the study, we asked them to make recommendations on their findings. And yet the state of South Dakota spends somewhere, and the figure is vague because I've seen all kinds of estimates, somewhere between $25,000 and $50,000 for a tax study, and then not only doesn't ask for, they say they do not want any recommendations. And do you know why they didn't want recommendations? Because they knew what the answer would be. They should have known what the answer would be. The HRSA Tax Study Committee told them that back in 1959. And I don't know how many more tax studies we're going to have. I see the Greater South Dakota Association wants to do another one yet. We don't need more tax studies in South Dakota. We need reform of our system. Our state has over-relied on the property tax so badly that we are now #1 in the nation in reliance on property taxes as a revenue source, averaging $69.76 per $1,000 of personal income, which is 64% above the national average of $44.87. It's time for a change. The tax initiative will give the voters the opportunity to make that change themselves. We are tired of waiting for a legislature that has shown year after year after year after year it will refuse to give equity to our system, so let's do it ourselves. You know, if you go back and you do a little studying of history and you study the property tax, you would find that it was historically designed to finance just 3 things in our society: sewage, garbage, and fire. And that's all. It was never created to finance what I like to call the social overhead costs of our society: health, welfare, police, and particularly education. Because these are social costs, they are costs of all of the people and not just the people that own property. And because they are costs of all the people and the benefits of them are shared by all of the people, the costs of them should be shared by all the people through an income tax and not just a tax imposed upon those that own property. That's a story we've also tried to tell the legislature year after year. And they continue to try to sweep it under the rug. The situation is so critical in South Dakota because of the legislature's failure to provide this needed tax reform that many distressed school districts in our state are now being victimized. And if you do a little more history and you read your South Dakota Constitution, you would find that it clearly places the responsibility for fair and equal educational opportunities for all South Dakota children on state government, not school districts. And to make up for the legislature's failure to act on tax reform, school districts throughout our state now are being forced to take some pretty serious alternatives, I'm sorry to say. Some are enacting a city sales tax. Some are increasing the mill levy and thus adding another burden on real estate. They're even talking about boosting tuition fees for students. Or they can do, as some are already doing, cutting curriculum. In other words, reducing the education that is being offered to our young people. In effect, then, penalizing our children for our failure to provide a source of revenue to meet our state's pressing needs. I am particularly enthused over our new tax proposal. I think it is a proposal that offers something for everyone. I think it meets the standards of equity and fairness that are lacking in our system. Wage earners have been the most critical of the talk of any income tax for South Dakota. And yet the average wage earner in South Dakota will benefit from this tax bill, particularly if he owns a home or is buying a home. And if he isn't buying a home, this bill would encourage him to do so. Now let's examine this proposal just real briefly and run through it a little bit and see what it's all about. Some of you already know about it, and you'll have to bear with me. But it doesn't hurt, you know, anytime you educate somebody, you try to repeat and repeat and repeat. And eventually you become so fully informed that you can become a public relations carrier to sell this bill. And that's what we need to sell it in South Dakota. A lot of public relations carriers. Well, basically, the bill is going to do three things. It's going to give tax relief to our overburdened personal property taxpayers by completely repealing this antiquated and unfair personal property tax over a 3-year period. Secondly, and this is what should particularly be attractive to the guy in town, the guy who's seen the taxes on his house increase by probably 40% in the last 5 years, and that is, it provides for a homeowner's exemption, which will allow a homeowner to deduct up to $150 from his real estate taxes. He'll have $150 knocked off his real estate taxes if his house is assessed at least $6,000. Third, it'll provide increased state aid to education. We estimate it will bring in about $6 million the first year alone in increased state aid to education, and that is a conservative estimate. Now, to finance these three things, to provide the money that is going to be needed to repeal that personal property tax over a 3-year period, to finance this homeowner's exemption, provide this money for education, this act would impose a tax upon an individual's federal income taxes. In other words, the amount of federal income taxes you pay, you would then pay a 10% state income tax the first year. 10% of whatever you paid Uncle Sam in federal income taxes, you'd pay that in a state income tax. The second year of this act, when 2/3 of the personal property tax will have been repealed, the individual rate would go to 14%. And the third year, when all $27 million of the personal property tax will have been repealed, the rate would go to 18%. Now, it will also levy a tax on corporations. And this is where there's been a tremendous misunderstanding. The tax on corporations will not be a percentage of their federal income taxes. It will be a direct percentage of their net profits, their net income. And the rate will be 10% the first year, 11% the second year, and 12% the third year. In addition to that, we're going to repeal the Bank Franchise Act. Now, the Bank Franchise Act, for those of you who are not familiar with it, was an act that was enacted some years ago for banks to pay what amounts to about a 4.5% adjusted gross income tax, and it's not adjusted gross, it's an income tax, but it isn't even filed on the federal form, and it's so full of loopholes that you wouldn't believe it. It has to be, or else the tax collections under the bank franchise tax would be higher. But this act was enacted so that banks wouldn't have to pay the personal property tax. In lieu of personal property taxes, banks pay the bank franchise tax. In other words, all this expensive computers, and you can about imagine what the personal property in a bank would come to in cost. But they don't pay a nickel of taxes on that equipment. And total collections to the state of South Dakota last year from the bank franchise tax were just over $500,000. No wonder there's so many new banks around the state. Well, since banks are a corporation, We're going to treat them the same as any other corporation, and we're going to repeal the Bank Franchise Act, and they will then pay a corporation income tax the same as the other corporations, which I think is only fair. Why should a bank be singled out any different from the other corporations? Now, we've got a big job ahead of us. Thank God we have a coalition working to do the job, and not just one organization. And hopefully this coalition will grow and blossom into a large, growing conglomerate, almost you might call it, of groups and organizations and individuals. The bill, the actual petition effort was kicked off by 5 organizations: South Dakota Farmers Union, the National Farmers Organization, the South Dakota Consumers League, the Independent Stock Growers of South Dakota, or of America, South Dakota Division, and the South Dakota Taxpayers Association. We are getting endorsements of support from several REA cooperatives around the state. We are hopeful of getting the Retail Farm Equipment Dealers Association on our side. We are working with some other groups, and between now and election time, we are hopeful that we will get many more groups and individuals involved in this tremendous effort that is going to be needed. There is a big job ahead, and it's a job that's going to require some money, a lot of it. And this is one of the tasks that the coalition has been discussing at recent meetings we've been having: how to raise this money. And we are hopeful that the taxpayers of this state, so disenchanted with our inequitable system, will respond to this need by giving us a check or cash to help in this worthy effort. We don't care if you feel strong enough to give 100, we'll sure take it. If you want to give 5, we'll welcome that. Any amount will be welcome in this needed effort. And the money will be well spent, I assure you. We're planning a tremendous advertising campaign. We intend to use ads in our weekly newspapers, in our daily newspapers. We hope to buy some television time. We have already signed a contract for about $3,500 worth of billboards in South Dakota. So we're working. We hope to organize a speakers bureau so that I don't have to make so many meetings, so that we can get people to talk to the groups and service clubs in all of the towns in the state, to let them know what this bill is all about, because I'm confident if they are fully informed what the bill is all about, they will support it. At the present time, our opposition is coming through ignorance and misinformation. We are preparing a brochure. This is a rough draft of it right here. We intend to get this brochure printed in a couple of colors and circulate it at fairs, home shows, wherever possible to get wide distribution. These are some of the things your coalition has been working on. It's a busy but a worthy project. And the time was never more critical than it is right now. And we have one thing on our side, possibly. The second half of property taxes are going to be due the 1st of November. And it's going to be a real item with people when they make out the check. And then maybe they will realize